The silence that descends upon a hospital room is unlike any other. It is a dense, absolute stillness where the only movement is the slow, deliberate drip of an IV bag, and the only soundtrack is the unsettling rhythm of your own survival. Elias Vance, the quiet genius who once commanded a billion-dollar company, was now reduced to a simple, struggling patient, his world condensed to the four pale walls of a sterile room. And it was in this profound, physical isolation that the slow, chilling realization of his professional abandonment began to set in. He had expected the pain of the chemotherapy to be overwhelming. He had prepared his mind for the inevitable physical degradation. But he was utterly unprepared for the coldness emanating from the world he had sacrificed his life to build. His initial days were a blur of aggressive treatment, invasive tests, and the crushing fatigue that follows the poisoning of one's own system. Through the fog of nausea and exhaustion, the company remained his absolute focus. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain. He had protected the stock price by keeping his terminal diagnosis a secret, and had handed the keys to his trusted partner. Now, he needed Greg to fulfill his. Elias tried to maintain contact. He didn't demand status updates on the IPO, he simply requested confirmation that the critical security patch he had designed hours before his collapse had been properly deployed to the core servers. This was not about power, it was about the technical integrity of his life's work. His first attempt was a text message, sent 48 hours after his admission, a simple, non-alarming query. Greg, security patch 4.0.1 must be deployed before the New York meetings. Did you confirm deployment? The response, when it finally arrived 12 hours later, was jarringly casual. Relax, buddy. Got it handled. Investors are hungry. Everything is great. Focus on getting better. Got it handled. That phrase, which should have been reassuring, felt dismissive. It lacked the technical confirmation Elias needed. He tried calling later that day. Greg's number went straight to voicemail, which was immediately suspicious. Greg never missed a call, his entire persona was built around being accessible and charismatic. Elias left a calm, authoritative message, detailing the exact protocol for checking the patch deployment. Days bled into a week. Elias called the office, not Greg, but his old chief of staff, a loyal, efficient woman named Anya. The conversation was stilted, hesitant. Anya spoke in short, cautious sentences, avoiding any direct references to Greg's actions. She confirmed Greg was now operating with full authority, and was very busy preparing for the institutional investor dinners. Elias's sixth sense, the intuition that allowed him to spot a single flaw in a million lines of code, was screaming a warning. This wasn't the silence of efficiency, it was the chilling silence of omission. The complete blackout from Greg was now undeniable. Elias's calls were systematically ignored. His emails, which transitioned from polite inquiries about the security patch to urgent demands for confirmation, were met with automated out-of-office replies or, worse, cryptic, non-committal one-liners sent by Greg's personal assistant. Mr. Thorne is currently in a crucial, closed-door strategy session. Elias lay in his hospital bed, his body weak, his mind razor-sharp with dread. He realized that Greg was not merely busy, he was actively evading him. The IPO roadshow was approaching, and Greg had effectively erected a firewall around the company, locking Elias out completely. He managed to get his laptop set up, fighting through the dizziness of his medication. He logged into his professional communication channels, only to find he had been quietly removed from the crucial operational group chats. His access to the shared document archives, the core R&D files and the critical future development planning had been restricted to read-only. This was not carelessness, this was calculated exclusion. Greg was moving to make Elias's input irrelevant. The most profound shock came when Elias managed to access the IPO deck, the highly anticipated final presentation that was to be shown to the major investors. He scrolled through the pages, his heart sinking with every slide. The entire presentation had been radically restructured. The section detailing the future development of the core data compression technology, Elias's brainchild, the most valuable piece of intellectual property they owned, had been dramatically minimized. Where there should have been 10 slides detailing the next-generation architecture and its scalability, there were now only 2, reduced to vague, generalized marketing slogans. Instead, the presentation was overwhelmingly focused on a new initiative, a short-term, high-profit data monetization service that leveraged their existing user base. This service had been Greg's pet project, a shallow, unsustainable revenue stream that Elias had repeatedly argued against because it compromised the long-term vision and diluted the purity of the core technology. Elias stared at the slide detailing the new executive compensation structure. It was bloated, excessive, and placed Greg at the absolute center of every bonus pool and stock option. The text detailing the compression technology, the very soul of the company, was buried in an appendix, almost as an afterthought. The cold reality struck Elias with the force of physical pain, sharper than any tumor. Greg was not just managing the company, he was hijacking it. He wasn't guarding the legacy, he was preparing to sell off the foundation, maximize his personal gain in the immediate IPO, and pivot the company toward his own, short-sighted, profitable interests. He was systematically cutting out the core tech, the very genius Elias had fought so hard to protect. Because it was complex, required maintenance, and didn't fit Greg's simple, high-profit sales narrative, Elias, fueled by a renewed, icy rage that temporarily eclipsed his physical suffering, knew he had to act. He tried calling his own appointed board seat representative, a venture capitalist named Ms. Davies, a woman he had always considered a solid, rational ally. Ms. Davies' assistant answered, offering a polite, but firm wall of evasion. Ms. Davies was in meetings, traveling, unavailable. When Elias finally insisted, identifying himself as the co-founder, the assistant put him on a brief hold and returned with a chilling, pre-programmed response. Mr. Vance, I'm instructed to inform you that Mr. Thorne has assumed temporary executive powers under the emergency clauses stipulated in your medical leave. All operational and strategic inquiries must be directed to his office. This wasn't just evasion, this was conspiracy. Greg hadn't just taken control, he had used the medical leave paperwork and the power of attorney, POA, to manipulate the board into formally recognizing his absolute, unchallenged authority. Elias was not merely absent, he had been legally rendered voiceless. He had believed the board, comprised of seasoned financial veterans, would never allow one partner to ruthlessly sideline the other, especially the one who held the intellectual property. But Greg, the master salesman, had clearly convinced them that Elias's debilitating condition made him a risk, and that only Greg, the charismatic, healthy face, could ensure the IPO's success. The board, seeing the imminent millions, chose stability and profitability over loyalty and ethics. Lying there, weak and betrayed, Elias connected the dots. The restricted access, the ignored calls, the restructuring of the IPO deck, the silence from the board, it all painted a single, horrifying picture. Greg had seized the moment of Elias's maximum vulnerability to execute a corporate coup. He had not just stolen the company, he was preparing to dismantle Elias's life's work for short-term gain, using the very secret Elias had entrusted him with as the final, absolute weapon. A cold, determined resolve began to replace the fear in Elias's chest. He was dying, yes, but he was also the victim of a calculated, massive betrayal. He was powerless to stop the chemotherapy, but he was absolutely unwilling to allow Greg to destroy his creation. He had protected the company from the external threat, now, he had to figure out how to protect it from the internal monster he had just unleashed. The silent betrayal from the boardroom had given Elias something more potent than health, purpose. He knew now that his fight was no longer just against the cancer, it was against the ruthless avarice of the man he had once called his brother. The time for pleading was over. The time for justice, however weak his body might be, had begun. He closed his eyes and started formulating the counterattack, realizing his most dangerous enemy was already wearing the company badge. They believed they had paid for my silence, but the truth was, they had paid for the key to their own architectural collapse. The $50,000 was merely the transactional artifact that confirmed their utter complacency. While Wallace held his celebratory meeting, praising Tristan's seamless transition and congratulating himself on a cheap, clean break, I sat calmly in my sunroom, watching the quiet, green line of the Orphan Key data stream reveal the intricate tapestry of their undoing. This was not a system failure born of external attack, it was a self-inflicted wound born of ignorance. The true value of my expertise was never in the code that worked, but in the single, deliberate weakness I had woven into the core system, a weakness that only the architect of Project Hydra knew existed. It was not a bug. A bug is an error, this was a precaution, an intentional vulnerability crafted years ago. During the system's deep development phase, intended to ensure that no single power, not even a hostile board, could completely control my creation without my consent or intervention. I called it the Orphan Key. The name was chosen to reflect its purpose. A single key, existing outside the system's official governance, designed to rescue the architecture should its parent company abandon it, or, as was the case now, betray its creator. It was the digital embodiment of a failsafe, a final, unchallengeable control switch hidden beneath layers of sophisticated firewalls. To understand its profound power, one must understand the complexity of Project Hydra itself. Hydra was not merely a database, it was a self-learning neural network that processed the company's most sensitive financial projections and proprietary intellectual property. It was designed to anticipate market shifts and preempt regulatory risks. For 2 years, I had poured my entire institutional memory into its development, creating a system that operated with a subtle, intuitive logic that went far beyond mere programming. When I first designed Hydra, I insisted that the authentication system be triple-layered. The board and their external consultants saw only the first 2 layers, the standard corporate password authentication and the 2-factor biometric access for senior management. These were the systems Tristan now controlled, believing he was fully in command. But the truth was hidden in the third, unwritten, and entirely personal layer. This third layer, the Orphan Key, was composed of exactly 1 line of code. It was an obscure entry point into the system's diagnostic kernel, buried deep within a tertiary data processing module that never communicated with the main network. This single line allowed for a passive, full-spectrum data mirror to be established, recording every command, every input, and every minute metric of the system's performance, all without triggering a single security alert. The genius of the Orphan Key was its activation mechanism. It required a non-replicable, physical key card that I still possessed, combined with a precise digital passphrase known only to me, a string of code based on an old academic cipher that predated modern computing. It was analog security protecting a digital lock. Without both the physical and the precise cognitive key, that line of code was invisible, inert, and functionally non-existent to Tristan and the board's security team. They had been so meticulous in wiping my system access, so thorough in their clean break, that they had successfully erased every trail leading back to the official routes. But they had completely forgotten to check the one place where security is truly tested, the creator's absolute control over the fundamental architecture. They had locked the front door, but left the architect with the only skeleton key. For 2 days, that Orphan Key had confirmed my worst fears. Tristan, in his desperate attempt to look agile and competent, had begun running a series of hasty, ill-advised patches. Each patch was a compounding error, a shallow fix that was destabilizing the deeper predictive functions of Hydra. The data streaming to my sunroom confirmed that Tristan's latest patch, designed to prevent a minor data leakage, had catastrophically compromised the system's external security protocol. He had effectively created a backdoor in the client-facing portal that an amateur could exploit. The integrity of the company's entire client portfolio, their most valuable non-proprietary asset, was now hanging by a thread, all because Tristan lacked the comprehensive, deep-dive understanding that only the architect possessed. The clock was now ticking toward a public, reputation-shattering crisis. A complete shutdown would have been preferable to this subtle, insidious breach. A shutdown could be explained away as maintenance. A data breach resulting from gross negligence could topple the empire. I had all the proof I needed recorded and timestamped by the Orphan Key. The time for passive observation was over. The realization that they were so close to professional suicide was chilling, but it did not surprise me. Corporate arrogance breeds this kind of institutional blindness. The board believed that competence was interchangeable, a commodity you could purchase with an aggressive salary and a prestigious degree. They failed to realize that true, specialized skill is a partnership between the mind and the architecture, and that partnership could not be transferred with a severance package. The key to the counterstrike was not just having the data, but knowing precisely how and when to use the threat of exposure. Helen Sharma had emphasized that we must not file the legal petition until the board was actively gathering to celebrate their victory, the moment when their confidence was highest and their guard lowest. Their belief in their clean break must be absolute before we shattered it. I placed the call to Helen, the Orphan Key data running in the background, projecting onto a spare monitor in my study. The green lines of cascading failure were undeniable, a silent, damning indictment of the board's decision to prioritize aesthetics over engineering. Helen, I stated, my voice devoid of haste, the window is opening. The data shows they have introduced a profound vulnerability in the client portal. It will be detectable externally, and therefore exploitable, by tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., precisely when their internal victory luncheon is scheduled. Helen's reaction was exactly the cold, focused urgency I needed. A public exploit during a celebratory luncheon. The optics are perfect, Evelyn. It moves the entire matter from an internal HR dispute to a profound breach of fiduciary duty. We have the leverage for unconditional surrender. We do, I confirmed. But we must ensure they feel the full weight of their self-inflicted wound before the public becomes aware. The goal is not public damage, the goal is focused, private accountability. I instructed Helen to execute the primary strategy, sending an encrypted, untraceable message to Mr. Wallace's private, non-corporate cell phone, a number I knew from a time when my access was still unquestioned. The message would be concise, devastating, and entirely technical. It would contain the single, irrefutable proof point of the impending external vulnerability, accompanied by a demand for an immediate, unscheduled meeting. The contents of the message were critical. It could not come from me, the fired executive, but from a source they would recognize as unchallengeable, a phantom security expert who had quietly penetrated their deepest architecture. The message simply contained a screenshot of the Orphan Key's data stream showing the precise vulnerability, and a single, chilling question: are you prepared for 9 a.m.? The strategic elegance of the move lay in its ambiguity. They wouldn't know who sent it, but they would instantly recognize the gravity of the threat. The vulnerability was too technical, too precise to be a general hack. It pointed directly to insider knowledge they thought they had bought for $50,000. It would instantly shatter their illusion of control. I looked at the simple metal key card resting on my desk, the physical component of the Orphan Key. It was a tangible reminder that my professional life was not an asset they could sell, transfer, or discard. It was an intricate, complex creation that required the constant presence of its creator. And that creator was now their most formidable enemy. The emotional state shifted from cold analysis to the grim satisfaction of knowing that the execution of justice was now imminent. I felt no triumph yet, only the deep, profound stillness that comes just before an explosion. The silence they had paid for was about to be broken by the sound of their own system screaming under the weight of Tristan's hubris, and the board's profound error in judgment. The waiting period after sending the encrypted message to Wallace was the most difficult. It required an absolute stillness that contradicted the chaos I knew was erupting within the corporate tower. I pictured Wallace receiving the message, his initial dismissal giving way to frantic, whispered conversations with Tristan and the in-house security chief. They would be scrambling, running diagnostics, trying desperately to find the source of the data leak, or the impending vulnerability, the very vulnerability I had intentionally created and then meticulously monitored. The beauty of the Orphan Key's access was that it was non-invasive. Their security sweep would turn up nothing but clean logs, deepening their confusion and panic. The evidence I sent was real, undeniable, and yet, completely untraceable. This uncertainty was my greatest ally. They couldn't fight what they couldn't find, and they couldn't dismiss the warning because the vulnerability was too devastatingly accurate. The phone rang precisely 30 minutes after the message was sent. It was Wallace. He didn't use his corporate line, but his private, almost never used personal cell phone, the desperation evident in the secrecy of his communication. His voice, usually smooth and authoritative, was thin, strained, and laced with genuine fear. "Evelyn," he whispered, not even bothering with a greeting or a false pleasantry. "I received an unusual message. I need to understand what is happening." The transition was supposed to be complete. Is this related to the severance package?" I allowed another long, agonizing pause. He had tied the impending crisis back to the transaction, confirming that he understood the true nature of their mistake. The $50,000 was now a burden, a reminder of the colossal undervaluation of my expertise. "The Orphan Key is active, Mr. Wallace," I stated simply, using the precise, technical term I knew he would never have heard before. I gave no further explanation. The ambiguity was the weapon. The what?" he stammered. "Evelyn, this is highly inappropriate. If you have retained unauthorized access, that is a violation of the non-compete clause, not to mention federal statutes. You must cease and desist immediately, or we will pursue every legal option." His threat was predictable, the reflex of a cornered man using the only language he knew, the language of corporate intimidation. But his words were meaningless. He couldn't prove I had retained access, only that I possessed knowledge they desperately lacked. "You dismissed my skill as incompatible with your brand, Mr. Wallace," I replied, my voice cold, calm, and utterly resolved. "You attempted to purchase my silence for $50,000. The cost of retaining my professional honor and protecting the architecture I created is not for sale at that price. If this matter proceeds to 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, the reputational damage will make the financial cost of this quarter's vulnerability irrelevant." "What do you want?" he finally choked out. The shift from intimidation to naked pleading was instantaneous. He saw the edge of the abyss, and the Matriarch was the only one who could pull him back. "I want an unscheduled, immediate meeting. Now? Not with your lawyers, not with your security chief, and certainly not with Tristan. Just you, Camilla, and the chief financial officer. Bring a single, authorized legal representative. And bring the documentation detailing the full cost of replacing my expertise, not the cost of my severance. You have 1 hour to assemble. If you are late, the next information I release will be public." I hung up the phone, severing the connection without waiting for his terrified acceptance. The final decision was made. They had tried to banish me to the last row of the boardroom. Now, I was demanding to meet them at the front row of a negotiation table that held the future of their entire enterprise. The simple line of code, the secret I knew, had worked perfectly. The empire was not yet toppled, but it was bowing. As I left Helen's discreet office and drove toward the agreed-upon meeting location, a neutral, quiet corporate suite across town, I felt the full weight of the transformation. I was no longer the quiet woman who had accepted her humiliation in the last row. I was the architect, armed with proof of their catastrophic incompetence, and backed by a legal strategy so sharp and focused it felt like armor. The air in the neutral suite was thick with tension when I arrived. Wallace, Camilla, and the CFO were already there, seated around a small table. They looked drawn, their expensive suits rumpled, their expressions tight with a mixture of fear and barely suppressed hostility. Their internal lawyer, a nervous man named Mr. Thompson, sat next to Wallace, clutching a thick binder of confidentiality agreements. Wallace did not look up when I entered. He remained hunched over the table, fiddling with a pen. Camilla offered a strained, almost hysterical smile that vanished quickly under my unyielding gaze. I didn't take a seat immediately. I stood at the end of the table, allowing my presence to dominate the small room. I watched as Mr. Thompson, the internal counsel, slid a fresh confidentiality agreement across the table, his hand shaking slightly. Mrs. Reed, Thompson began, his voice dry, we must insist that before any discussion proceeds regarding the unusual message Mr. Wallace received, you sign this updated non-disclosure agreement. Any information discussed here is strictly confidential. I finally moved, not to sign the paper, but to remove my briefcase from my shoulder and place it heavily on the table. I opened it, not revealing legal documents. Now, I was demanding to meet them at the front row of a negotiation table that held the future of their entire enterprise. The simple line of code, the secret I knew, had worked perfectly. The empire was not yet toppled, but it was bowing. As I left Helen's discreet office and drove toward the agreed-upon meeting location, a neutral, quiet corporate suite across town, I felt the full weight of the transformation. I was no longer the quiet woman who had accepted her humiliation in the last row. I was the architect, armed with proof of their catastrophic incompetence, and backed by a legal strategy so sharp and focused it felt like armor. The air in the neutral suite was thick with tension when I arrived. Wallace, Camilla, and the CFO were already there, seated around a small table. They looked drawn, their expensive suits rumpled, their expressions tight with a mixture of fear and barely suppressed hostility. Their internal lawyer, a nervous man named Mr. Thompson, sat next to Wallace, clutching a thick binder of confidentiality agreements. Wallace did not look up when I entered. He remained hunched over the table, fiddling with a pen. Camilla offered a strained, almost hysterical smile that vanished quickly under my unyielding gaze. I didn't take a seat immediately. I stood at the end of the table, allowing my presence to dominate the small room. I watched as Mr. Thompson, the internal counsel, slid a fresh confidentiality agreement across the table, his hand shaking slightly. Mrs. Reed, Thompson began, his voice dry, we must insist that before any discussion proceeds regarding the unusual message Mr. Wallace received, you sign this updated non-disclosure agreement. Any information discussed here is strictly confidential. I finally moved, not to sign the paper, but to remove my briefcase from my shoulder and place it heavily on the table. I opened it, not revealing legal documents. The silence that followed my demand was not peaceful, it was explosive. It was the moment the matriarch pulled the pin, and the board realized they were holding the explosive device. The sheer, paralyzing fear in that room was more potent than any system alert. They were faced not with an enraged former employee, but with the cold, undeniable proof of a catastrophic blunder that threatened their careers, their wealth, and their entire reputation. The power had shifted completely, from the collective arrogance of the executive table to the single, self-possessed woman standing at its head. The chief financial officer, whose primary concern was always the balance sheet, was the first to move. His hand, shaking slightly, reached for the USB drive containing the full log of Tristan's cascading failures. He plugged it into a secured laptop, his face immediately illuminated by the stark metrics of the system's unraveling. As the data streamed across the screen, the timestamps of the security protocol corruption, the exact location of the external portal vulnerability, his complexion drained, the color fleeing from his face as the financial ruin became quantifiable. Wallace, the chairman, attempted one last, desperate grasp at authority. Evelyn, this cannot be true. This is engineered. This is extortion. Our legal team will tear this apart. His voice lacked conviction, a hollow echo of the tone he had used to dismiss me. Your legal team is already preparing their defense against a shareholder lawsuit citing gross mismanagement, I corrected him calmly, not raising my voice, forcing him to strain to hear the cold truth. My lawyer, Helen Sharma, is holding that petition. The data you are viewing is live, Mr. Wallace. You have less than 12 hours until the exploit is viable, and your system will become an open book. Your lawyers are not a solution, they are now simply a liability to manage. I allowed the threat to sink in, watching the terror take hold. Camilla, the head of marketing, whose entire career was built on perception and public image, was visibly crumbling. The thought of a public data breach, a headline that would utterly shatter the brand fit she so cherished, was her personal apocalypse. I finally took a seat, deliberately choosing the chair opposite Wallace, establishing myself as the definitive counter-authority. I did not relax, I maintained a posture of coiled vigilance. I reached into my briefcase, not for the Orphan Key, but for the one document they truly feared, the remediation proposal. I slid the single, heavy sheet of paper across the table. It was thick with legal demands, but its essence was simple, unconditional surrender. I had meticulously crafted the terms to reverse every single insult and injustice, converting their arrogance into my absolute authority. This is not a negotiation, I stated, my eyes locking onto Wallace's. This is your only option for immediate, quiet, and complete risk mitigation. The clock is already ticking toward 9 a.m. tomorrow. You have 72 hours to accept every single term of this proposal. If the deadline passes without your signed compliance, I will release the complete, documented history of this mismanagement to the financial press and the primary regulatory bodies. The ultimatum was delivered not with rage, but with the focused determination of a surgeon presenting a necessary, painful procedure. The matriarch was back, and she was demanding the price of her rescue. The board's initial reaction to the proposal was a chaotic display of disbelief and panic. The internal counsel, Mr. Thompson, finally managed to stammer, "Mrs. Reed, these demands, they are exorbitant. They completely dismantle the board's governance structure. They merely remediate the structural failures caused by the board's governance," I countered, leaning forward, emphasizing the word remediate. "Your decision to fire the architect and replace her with an inexperienced junior based on a superficial preference for brand fit was the failure. These terms are the required fix." I systematically dictated the core demands, ensuring that each one addressed and reversed a specific injustice from the original humiliation. First, the financial remuneration. I didn't ask for severance. I demanded the immediate and irrevocable establishment of the Hydra Architecture Integrity Fund, a multi-million-dollar account, calculated on the full replacement cost of my expertise, not my old salary. This fund was to be used exclusively to ensure the system's stability, and I was to be named the sole, fiduciary administrator, fully salaried and reporting only to the Independent Audit Committee. This reversed the insult of the paltry consultation fee. Second, the structural re-entry. I demanded the immediate termination of Tristan, not out of malice, but because his continued presence represented a measurable risk to the architecture. I demanded the immediate creation of a new, executive-level role for myself, Chief Strategic Architect. This role would grant me total, non-negotiable oversight over all future technological and architectural decisions. This reversed the insult of being deemed incompatible. Third, the legal framework. I demanded that the board issue a private, signed, and legally binding document acknowledging that my dismissal was based on unfounded managerial preferences that prioritized aesthetics over essential operational expertise. This document would explicitly invalidate the non-compete clause for all future endeavors and confirm the non-hostile nature of my re-engagement. This reversed the humiliation of the boardroom dismissal. Fourth, the leverage. The Orphan Key would be secured and documented by an independent third-party firm chosen by Helen Sharma, but the access code would remain exclusively mine, held in escrow. My access to the system was no longer a matter of employment, it was a matter of necessary, systemic trust. This ensured that my value was permanently non-negotiable. I gave them no room to breathe, no space to retreat into procedural defense. I used the time I had waited, the quiet, meticulous hours of my surveillance, to construct a perfect, inescapable trap. The shock in the room deepened. They realized they were no longer negotiating with an employee, they were dealing with the matriarch, who had seized control of the foundation. The sheer weight of the ultimatum crushed their resistance. The CFO, realizing the impending doom of a public data breach, pleaded with Wallace. "Mr. Wallace, we have to mitigate the risk. This proposal, financially, is less devastating than a single day of data breach penalties and regulatory fines. We have no choice." Camilla, obsessed with the public narrative, found her voice. "Evelyn, the press release. If we can spin this as a strategic, planned re-engagement of essential expertise, we can save the branding. We can frame this as foresight." Their focus had shifted completely from my humiliation to their survival. This was the moment of ultimate professional justice. Wallace, pale and utterly defeated, finally spoke, his voice hollow. 72 hours, Evelyn. This is too fast. We need to convene the full board, consult our external litigation team. I cut him off, my voice sharp, unforgiving. "The vulnerability I exposed becomes public at 9 a.m. tomorrow, Mr. Wallace. Every minute you waste consulting lawyers on their fee structure is a minute closer to irreversible ruin. 72 hours is generous. It grants you time to execute the paperwork and ensure the funds are legally segregated. It does not grant you time to contemplate betrayal." I rose from the table, gathering my papers. I did not touch the remediation proposal, it remained on the table, a stark reminder of the terms of their surrender. "You have the terms. You have the timeline," I concluded. "Do not contact me until the final documents are prepared, communicate only through Helen Sharma. And I advise you to ensure that Tristan does not touch Project Hydra again. The chief strategic architect has officially informed the board of the system's operational status. The next move is yours." I walked out of the neutral suite, leaving them in the chilling silence of their own making. The room that had been filled with their confidence now contained their utter despair. They had bought my silence for $50,000, believing they were purchasing a clean exit. They discovered, too late, that they had only paid the down payment on their own humiliation, empowering me to return on terms they never could have imagined. The silence from the boardroom was a heavy, calculated quiet, but the reaction from my son, Michael, was immediate, desperate, and entirely personal. The corporate world had tried to intimidate me with lawyers and non-compete clauses. Michael tried to dismantle me with emotional blackmail. He didn't work directly for the company that fired me, but his entire career trajectory, his network, his social standing, and his reputation in the city's financial ecosystem, was inextricably linked to the perception of my former success, and critically, my failure. I was sitting in my study, reviewing the final drafts of Helen's legal petition, when his call arrived. It wasn't a calm, considered conversation, it was a sudden, emotional torrent, a frantic plea disguised as an accusation. I let the opening salvo wash over me, recognizing the cold fear that fueled his words. He had heard the frantic whispers spreading through the city's executive circles. The matriarch was back, and the board was crumbling. "Mom, what are you doing?" Michael demanded, his voice high and strained, completely devoid of the smooth, polished confidence he usually projected. "I just heard from a partner at my firm. They are saying you've sent the board an ultimatum. They are saying you're threatening to expose a security breach." "Mom, this is blackmail." I kept my hand steady, setting down my pen deliberately. "Hello, Michael. I was waiting for you to call. I see the news travels quickly when the stakes become personal." "Personal," he scoffed, the sound raw with anger and panic. "This is personal. You are destabilizing one of the biggest firms in the city. You have to understand the ripple effect this is going to have. This kind of aggressive action, this isn't just about you. It reflects on me. He had found the one true vulnerability, not of the Hydra architecture, but of my heart. He centered the entire crisis on his own risk, his career, his carefully constructed life. The insult of the board's betrayal momentarily faded, replaced by the acute, familiar pain of feeling judged by my own child. Reflects on you how, Michael? I asked, my voice low and authoritative, forcing him to meet my measured tone with his frantic emotion. Does it reflect on you that your mother was deemed incompatible after 3 decades of unparalleled service? Or does it reflect on you that I refuse to accept their paltry price for my professional dignity? He ignored the question, doubling down on his self-pity. You'll ruin my career. Don't you see? If you proceed with this petition, if you force Wallace to resign or cause a public scandal, I'll be collateral damage. People won't see justice, Mom. They'll see a bitter, vengeful woman destroying a prestigious firm. They'll see my mother as a threat. And no one wants to work with a threat. His words, intended to wound, only clarified the true nature of the professional environment he operated within. He feared not the injustice of my firing, but the inconvenience of my fight. He feared the truth of my character, the strength that demanded respect rather than silent retirement. He was a product of the very corporate arrogance I was fighting, the belief that maintaining a veneer of quiet. They are saying you're threatening to expose a security breach. Mom, this is blackmail. I kept my hand steady, setting down my pen deliberately. Hello, Michael. I was waiting for you to call. I see the news travels quickly when the stakes become personal. Personal, he scoffed, the sound raw with anger and panic. This is personal. You are destabilizing one of the biggest firms in the city. You have to understand the ripple effect this is going to have. This kind of aggressive action, this isn't just about you. It reflects on me. He had found the one true vulnerability, not of the Hydra architecture, but of my heart. He centered the entire crisis on his own risk, his career, his carefully constructed life. The insult of the board's betrayal momentarily faded, replaced by the acute, familiar pain of feeling judged by my own child. Reflects on you how, Michael? I asked, my voice low and authoritative, forcing him to meet my measured tone with his frantic emotion. Does it reflect on you that your mother was deemed incompatible after 3 decades of unparalleled service? Or does it reflect on you that I refuse to accept their paltry price for my professional dignity? He ignored the question, doubling down on his self-pity. You'll ruin my career. Don't you see? If you proceed with this petition, if you force Wallace to resign or cause a public scandal, I'll be collateral damage. People won't see justice, Mom. They'll see a bitter, vengeful woman destroying a prestigious firm. They'll see my mother as a threat. And no one wants to work with a threat. His words, intended to wound, only clarified the true nature of the professional environment he operated within. He feared not the injustice of my firing, but the inconvenience of my fight. He feared the truth of my character, the strength that demanded respect rather than silent retirement. He was a product of the very corporate arrogance I was fighting, the belief that maintaining a veneer of quiet, compliant success was more important than fighting for core professional integrity. I allowed a moment of profound silence to settle, the distance between us widening with every frantic syllable he had uttered. This moment was crucial. I couldn't treat him as the panicking executive he pretended to be. I had to speak to the son, who had forgotten the lessons of professional self-worth I had tried to teach him. You speak of ruin, Michael, I began, my voice hardening with controlled disappointment. I understand fear, but I will not accept this word from you. I was fired. My life's work was dismissed as incompatible. They attempted to buy my silence for $50,000, and you now ask me to accept that humiliation, for the sake of your perception. It's not about perception, Mom. It's about reality, he insisted, his voice cracking with exasperation. They call this corporate warfare. You're using an inside track, exploiting their vulnerability. They have lawyers who will call this extortion, and if the word gets out that my mother engaged in corporate extortion. Michael, I interrupted sharply, using a tone that instantly snapped him back to attention. I am the architect of that system. I did not exploit their vulnerability, I merely exposed the consequences of their professional negligence. The vulnerability exists because they prioritized a cheap, compliant junior over the stability of their architecture. That is not extortion, Michael. That is accountability. I pushed further, forcing him to face the moral core of the conflict, the very thing the board, and now, my son, was trying to dismiss. When I was dismissed to the last row of that boardroom, you did not call to ask if I was well. You waited until the news of my counter-strike reached your firm. Your loyalty is not to my dignity, Michael, it is to the perception of corporate stability. The weight of my words finally silenced him. He breathed heavily into the phone, grappling with the undeniable truth. He was being forced to choose between the quiet, false peace of the corporate status quo and the difficult, public fight for my professional integrity. He had always chosen the easy path, the path paved by my previous success. Now, that path required him to accept the uncomfortable reality that his mother was a force, not a liability. You need to step away from this, Mom, he finally said, his voice dropping to a desperate, low plea. I know a settlement is important, but a public lawsuit will destroy everything. Please, just take the severance, take a consultation fee, and let this go quietly. For my sake. For your peace. Peace, I repeated, tasting the word, finding it hollow. My peace is not for sale, Michael. And my dignity is not negotiable based on your career convenience. The determined matriarch in me refused to yield. I could manage the board's rage. I would not tolerate my son's emotional pressure. The core conflict was no longer about the board, it was about defining the moral legacy I was fighting for. I had to ensure that Michael understood that this confrontation, painful as it was for his carefully curated life, was necessary not for revenge, but for an essential principle. Michael, listen carefully, I instructed, my voice firm, but tempered with the weary authority of a mother who knows better. The board's initial offer was built on the assumption that professional self-respect is a commodity to be bought and sold. They assumed I would be silenced by a check and the fear of public opinion. If I walk away quietly now, I validate that assumption. I confirm that professional excellence is disposable when it challenges the corporate ego. But this will stick to you. You'll be known as the executive who committed corporate espionage, he argued, clinging to the only language he understood, reputation. I will be known as the architect who saved her creation from the incompetence of the board, I corrected him. Drawing a sharp, non-negotiable line in the sand. I am demanding a financial remediation that protects the architecture, not just my bank account. I am demanding a seat that ensures the failure of Project Hydra is corrected, not covered up. I am not demanding bankruptcy, Michael. I am demanding accountability for professional negligence. I paused, letting the finality of the statement settle. You need to consider what truly constitutes a ruined career. Is it the temporary turbulence caused by your mother fighting for truth, or is it building a life based on the silent, perpetual compromise of your own values? I gave him a pathway, a difficult but honest way back to me. I am giving the board 72 hours to accept my terms. I want you to use that time not to lobby for my surrender, but to ask yourself why your initial concern was for their stability, and not my dignity. He was silent then, a long, heavy silence that acknowledged the weight of my position. The frightened executive had momentarily retreated, leaving behind a conflicted son. I can't believe you're doing this, he finally whispered, the panic replaced by a slow, profound comprehension of the power I was wielding. Believe it, Michael, I replied, my voice holding a final, non-negotiable boundary. My professional honor is worth more than the quiet acceptance of your firm. When the board signs the final remediation agreement, you will understand that this was not a threat, it was a non-negotiable price of professional integrity. Now, I have work to do. Do not call me again until the board's 72 hours are complete. I ended the call, knowing the conversation was far from over. Michael's emotional pressure was the deepest scar of this conflict, but I had refused to let his fear dictate my definition of justice. The matriarch had stood firm, choosing her professional truth over the convenience of her son's career. The only thing left to do is wait for the clock to run out on the board's defiance. The 72 hours granted to the board were agonizing, filled not with the company's defiance, but with their frantic, whispered attempts to find a loophole. They tried everything, appealing to my former colleagues, dispatching internal security to trace the anonymous security warning which, thanks to the Orphan Key, vanished the instant they looked, and even trying to contact Michael again, hoping to leverage the scared son against the determined mother. I remained silent, communicating only through Helen Sharma. My silence was now my shield and my greatest negotiating tool. Helen, in turn, presented them with the unwavering, crystalline structure of my demands. She made it clear that while the financial terms, the multi-million-dollar remediation fund, were non-negotiable, the true core of the ultimatum was not financial at all. It was ethical. It was the demand that the board publicly acknowledge the precise nature of the injustice committed against me. They resisted this demand more fiercely than any financial penalty. They were prepared to hemorrhage funds to save the company's architecture, but they were absolutely terrified of signing a document that exposed their decision-making process to the light of professional integrity. They were terrified of the truth. I remember Helen summarizing their resistance over a secure call, her voice tight with professional amusement. "Evelyn, they've counted the financial package 3 times. They hate the integrity fund, but they'll pay it. What they absolutely refuse to sign is the statement. They call it professional suicide. It is only suicide if the truth is indefensible," I replied, staring out at the serene Chicago skyline, a perfect contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding in their tower. The financial penalty addresses the consequence of their failure. The public statement addresses the cause, their arrogance. Is wait for the clock to run out on the board's defiance. The 72 hours granted to the board were agonizing, filled not with the company's defiance, but with their frantic, whispered attempts to find a loophole. They tried everything, appealing to my former colleagues, dispatching internal security to trace the anonymous security warning which, thanks to the Orphan Key, vanished the instant they looked, and even trying to contact Michael again, hoping to leverage the scared son against the determined mother. I remained silent, communicating only through Helen Sharma. My silence was now my shield and my greatest negotiating tool. Helen, in turn, presented them with the unwavering, crystalline structure of my demands. She made it clear that while the financial terms, the multi-million-dollar remediation fund, were non-negotiable, the true core of the ultimatum was not financial at all. It was ethical. It was the demand that the board publicly acknowledge the precise nature of the injustice committed against me. They resisted this demand more fiercely than any financial penalty. They were prepared to hemorrhage funds to save the company's architecture, but they were absolutely terrified of signing a document that exposed their decision-making process to the light of professional integrity. They were terrified of the truth. I remember Helen summarizing their resistance over a secure call, her voice tight with professional amusement. "Evelyn, they've counted the financial package 3 times. They hate the integrity fund, but they'll pay it. What they absolutely refuse to sign is the statement. They call it professional suicide. It is only suicide if the truth is indefensible," I replied, staring out at the serene Chicago skyline, a perfect contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding in their tower. The financial penalty addresses the consequence of their failure. The public statement addresses the cause, their arrogance. They must acknowledge that the only reason they nearly suffered a catastrophic data breach was because they prioritized superficial appearances over essential, specialized expertise. The statement was meticulous. It didn't ask for an emotional apology, it demanded a factual declaration, legally binding and filed with the company's internal records, that my dismissal was based on unfounded managerial biases that incorrectly deemed specialized expertise as incompatible with the company's evolving brand image. This distinction, the demand for professional validation rather than mere financial compensation, was the true price of my truth. Money could be replaced, but dignity, once surrendered, leaves a permanent scar. I had to ensure that the record showed I was not a casualty of incompetence, but a victim of institutional arrogance. This public statement was the only way to surgically remove the taint of the incompatible label they had tried to brand me with. The board argued that such a statement would damage their stock price, expose them to litigation from shareholders who had lost money, and irrevocably ruin the careers of Wallace and Camilla. And they were right. But this was the cost of their freedom from the catastrophic breach, the cost of saving their company. The clock ticked down. With only 6 hours remaining before the deadline, Helen delivered my final, non-negotiable message: the matriarch is not demanding vengeance. She is demanding professional integrity. Accept the full terms, or face the consequences of the architectural collapse at 9 a.m. The line of distinction between justice and revenge was never finer, and I stood entirely on the side of justice. The ultimate breakdown of the board's defiance came an hour before the deadline. It was the chief financial officer who capitulated, realizing that their collective reputation was a fragile asset, easily shattered by a data breach. And that Wallace's ego was no longer worth the risk. He bypassed Wallace, contacting Helen directly, his voice a low monotone of complete defeat. "We accept the full remediation package," the CFO relayed, including the establishment of the Integrity Fund and the appointment of Mrs. Reed as the chief strategic architect. "The funds will be segregated immediately." Helen paused and then delivered the final, sharp blow. "And the statement?" The CFO sighed, the sound crackling over the secured line, the sound of a billion-dollar empire bowing to the will of one woman. "We will draft the document. We will sign the statement acknowledging the error in managerial judgment regarding specialized operational expertise. But Mrs. Reed must agree that this statement remains internal. It cannot be filed publicly." This was the final, small concession they desperately clung to, controlling the narrative. I accepted it. The point was not public spectacle, the point was the signed, legal acknowledgement of the truth. The vindication was in forcing them to put their signature beneath the admission that my expertise, my inherent worth, was irreplaceable. Within the hour, the signed, legally executed documents arrived at Helen's office. The file was immense, containing the confirmation of the multi-million-dollar Integrity Fund, the formal creation of the chief strategic architect role with my unchallengeable oversight, and most importantly, the 3-page statement detailing the board's error in prioritizing brand image over essential architectural integrity. I drove to Helen's office and stood over the signed documents, feeling no elation, only a profound, cold sense of closure. I hadn't destroyed the company, I had saved it from its own fatal arrogance. I hadn't pursued vengeance, I had achieved a rigorous, ethical justice that redefined my professional standing. The matriarch's will had prevailed. "The money is just a metric, Evelyn," Helen said, closing the file. "The statement is the victory. They had to sign the confession of their professional sin to save their skin." I nodded, picking up the statement and holding the heavy paper in my hands. The words were sterile, corporate, and precise, but they carried the immense weight of professional vindication. The incompatible woman had returned to claim the throne, forcing her abusers to sign the terms of her return. The humiliation of the boardroom had been surgically removed and replaced by an unchallengeable authority. The price of the truth had been paid in full. The next steps were immediate and precise. Tristan's contract was terminated, the Integrity Fund was secured, and the Orphan Key, my original digital weapon, was formally handed over to Helen's firm for secure, third-party escrow. I was no longer the threat. I was the solution. My expertise was no longer for sale, it was non-negotiable, permanently enshrined in the corporate structure I had saved. The signed documents lay before me, confirming my total victory. The financial penalty was levied, the chief strategic architect role secured, and the board's confession of error filed away. But the true measure of justice is not the size of the financial reward, it is what one chooses to do with the restored dignity. I had successfully forced the system to acknowledge the value of my skill, but the fight was incomplete as long as other incompatible professionals faced the same marginalization. My victory had to become a lasting resource for others. My thoughts turned immediately to the academic research lab I had planned to fund before the corporate chaos began, the Digital Ethics Research Lab at the university. That initial idea was now insufficient. My experience demanded a deeper, more personal commitment. The focus could no longer just be on systems, it had to be on the people whom arrogant institutions tried to discard. I called Dr. Eleanor Vance, the dean who had stood ready to welcome my expertise. She was the only person who understood that my commitment was now infused with a cold, uncompromising purpose. Eleanor, I stated, my voice measured and decisive. The board has complied fully. I am now overseeing the architecture, and have secured a substantial financial instrument, the Integrity Fund. I want to shift the focus of our project. It needs to be more than a lab, it needs to be a fortress for marginalized talent. I explained my concept, utilizing a portion of the vast, secured Integrity Fund to establish a permanent, endowed resource. I named it the Eleanor Tech Ethics Mentorship Fund. The name was deliberately chosen to honor Dr. Vance's unwavering integrity and to ensure the fund's focus remained outside the corrupting influence of corporate ego. The purpose of the fund was crystalline. It would provide resources, mentorship, and critical legal defense for students and mid-career professionals who faced institutional bias, those who, like me, were deemed incompatible because their skill was too specialized, their integrity too inconvenient, or their gender or background not fitting the brand image. I wanted the fund to be a direct rebuke to Wallace and Camilla's dismissal. It would specifically sponsor research into the ethics of algorithmic bias and provide grants for individuals whose architectural brilliance was undervalued by superficial management. This was the ultimate, strategic use of the leverage I had acquired. I was converting the money generated from corporate arrogance into a permanent resource dedicated to dismantling that arrogance from the ground up. Eleanor listened quietly, the enormity of the proposal sinking in. Evelyn, this endowment would ensure this work continues for generations. It transforms your professional setback into a permanent, institutional mechanism for justice. It does more than that, Eleanor, I confirmed. It ensures that the price they paid for their arrogance goes directly toward funding the very expertise they tried to suppress. The board is financing the end of their own institutional bias. Every grant, every mentorship, every breakthrough in ethics research will be a direct consequence of their professional sin. This act was the true, final closure on the humiliation I had endured. The boardroom dismissal, the attempt to purchase my silence, and the ensuing panic were now merely the necessary genesis of a powerful, lasting professional legacy. The official launch of the Eleanor Tech Ethics Mentorship Fund was quiet, deliberate, and entirely academic, precisely the opposite of the lavish, self-congratulatory events the board preferred. We chose a small, formal ceremony at the university, attended by industry leaders who valued true skill, former colleagues who had suffered similar quiet dismissals, and, critically, a group of bright, specialized students whose talent desperately needed protection. I stood before the room, not as the new chief strategic architect, but as the founder of the fund. My voice was calm, projecting authority, but also the deep wisdom born of painful experience. This fund is not a memorial to a career, I told the assembly. It is a commitment to the principle that expertise is non-negotiable. I have witnessed firsthand how institutions, driven by superficial branding and market trends, will discard brilliant, highly specialized talent simply because that talent does not fit the brand. They prefer compliance over competence. They prefer comfort over challenge. I spoke specifically about the importance of architectural integrity, the need for engineers and data scientists to build systems not just for profitability, but for ethical foresight. I spoke about the young professionals who would receive the grants, the students whose unique vision would now be supported against the crushing weight of corporate conformity. The money that funded their mentorship was the direct consequence of the board's documented arrogance. The most difficult, yet necessary, aspect of the day was the private conversation I finally had with my son, Michael. He arrived subdued, the panic replaced by a quiet, profound shame. He had seen the legal documentation, understood the severity of the board's blunder, and grasped the ethical necessity of my fight. His embarrassment at my aggressiveness had yielded to awe at my strategic success. "Mom," he said quietly, avoiding my eyes. I was wrong. I was only thinking about my career's surface, not the foundation. What they did to you, what you risked to make them admit the truth. I gently stopped him, cutting off his frantic attempts at apology. Your reaction was understandable, Michael. You valued quiet compliance over difficult truth. That is what the system teaches. But my victory is not just a financial recovery, it is a lesson for you, too. Your career is not defined by who you know, but by what you know, and how fiercely you protect the integrity of that knowledge. I looked at the fund's charter, deliberately linking my personal journey to its creation. The Eleanor Fund is my legacy, Michael. It exists so that the next generation of architects does not have to choose between their dignity and their paycheck. I am putting the money back into the hands of the specialists who will challenge the shallow conformity of the Wallaces and Camillas of the world. The conversation was restorative, establishing a new, difficult, but honest boundary between us. He had to realize that the matriarch's strength was not a liability to his career, but the essential, unyielding foundation of his own professional standards. He finally saw the difference between fear and strength, between vengeance and measured, principled justice. As I watched the first group of young, bright-eyed students gather around the display for the new fund, I felt a deep, profound peace settles over me. The pain of the corporate betrayal had been transmuted. The matriarch's will was complete, ensuring that my expertise would not only save the architecture I created, but would now fund the ethical education of generations of professionals who would know their worth from day one. I was ready now to walk back into that corporate tower, not as a victim or a contractor, but as the unchallengeable chief strategic architect. The game had truly begun. The day of my official return was marked not by trumpets, but by the nervous silence that permeated the executive floor. The board had signed the documents, the funds were segregated, and the confession of their professional error was filed. Now came the most public and potent act of my entire counterstrike, walking back into the corporate tower I had been banished from, not as a desperate supplicant, but as the unchallengeable chief strategic architect. The matriarch was returning to her throne. I chose my entrance deliberately. I arrived exactly at 9 a.m., the exact time the catastrophic security breach would have occurred had I not intervened. The timing was a silent, chilling reminder of the ruin I had saved them from. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, a contrast to the flashy attire of the marketing department, a uniform of absolute, sober authority. I needed no fanfare, my reputation, my power, and the terrifying knowledge of the Orphan Key spoke for themselves. I bypassed the general reception and went directly to the executive security checkpoint. The head of security, a cautious, silent man named Mr. Daniels, met me there. He knew everything. He had seen the logs, understood the severity of the threat I had neutralized, and respected the sheer strategic genius of my return. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile, he simply offered profound, professional deference. "Chief Architect," he murmured, using my new title for the first time. The sound of it was potent, correcting the injustice of the past. Your access is fully restored. The board requires you to proceed directly to the private conference room. I am aware of the schedule, Mr. Daniels, I replied, my voice steady. But my first priority is not the board. It is the architecture. I will proceed directly to the Project Hydra server room. I need physical confirmation that Tristan's disastrous patch has been reverted and that the network is stabilized. This was the first act of my absolute authority. I was prioritizing the integrity of my creation over the political convenience of the board. My new role meant that the architecture, not the board's fear, dictated the agenda. Daniels did not hesitate. He simply turned and led the way toward the subterranean server farms, the true beating heart of the company. As we moved through the complex, cold corridors toward the server racks, I passed the office I had occupied for 30 years. It was now Tristan's domain. I could see him inside, hunched over his desk, his face strained, speaking urgently into a phone. He looked small, defeated, and profoundly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the system he was no longer managing. The young man, who had been chosen for his brand fit, was now a professional casualty of the board's shallow arrogance. I felt no triumph watching him, only a detached confirmation that competence is never interchangeable. In the server room, the air was cold and loud with the collective hum of massive machinery. My technical team, the junior engineers who had always respected my expertise, looked up in shock, then relief. They knew the system was staggering. I didn't speak to them, I went straight to the console, logged in using my new, unchallengeable credentials, and quickly verified the security logs. The panic patch was gone, the network was stabilized, and the public threat was neutralized. My first act was complete, only after stabilizing the architecture. Did I proceed to the private conference room where the board awaited? The atmosphere was completely reversed from the humiliation of my dismissal. Then, I was seated on the periphery, an unwanted liability. Now, I walked in as the singular, necessary solution. Wallace, Camilla, and the CFO were seated, their postures tight with exhaustion and professional dread. Their lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was present, his file binder significantly thinner, the documents within now dictating surrender, not defense. I did not wait for them to speak. I walked straight to the head of the table, placing my briefcase containing the Orphan Key on the polished wood. I looked at Wallace, meeting his gaze with unyielding authority. The external threat has been neutralized, Mr. Wallace, I stated, my voice echoing the authority of the server room. The network is stable, and the breach risk is contained. However, the architecture is brittle, compromised by the mismanagement of the last 72 hours. My first action as Chief Strategic Architect is to implement a 6-month, total systemic lockdown on non-essential architectural changes. Wallace opened his mouth to protest, likely citing shareholder anxiety or market confidence. I cut him off instantly. I am not seeking your approval, Mr. Wallace, I explained, reminding him of the terms of my return. My role requires me to prioritize the integrity of the architecture above all other considerations. Your previous mismanagement is precisely why this lockdown is mandatory. You will inform the shareholders that this is a proactive measure to ensure long-term stability, overseen by the newly appointed Chief Strategic Architect. The final blow was delivered to Camilla. She attempted a strained, deferential smile. Evelyn, we need to handle the external narrative carefully. We need a strong PR message to spin this as an agile, planned transition. I can draft a communication emphasizing the brand fit of your return. The narrative is already written, Camilla, I countered, looking at her with cold finality. The narrative is that the board discovered a failure in judgment and corrected it by bringing in unchallengeable expertise. The narrative is that I define the brand now. You will issue a succinct statement confirming my new role and stating that all architectural decisions, effective immediately, are under my absolute, autonomous oversight. I spent the next hour reviewing the budget, surgically removing every expenditure associated with Tristan's team, and redirecting those funds toward the full operational capacity of the new Integrity Fund. I was not just back. I was controlling the company's financial and technical destiny. The humiliating attempt to dismiss me to quiet retirement had resulted in the Matriarch taking control of the wheel. As the meeting concluded, I stood, leaving the board members stunned and defeated at the table. I was the chief strategic architect, and the price of my rescue had been the permanent, structural acknowledgement that my professional skill was the single most powerful, non-negotiable asset in their entire organization. The humiliation was reversed, the debt paid, and the throne reclaimed. The true measure of my victory was not the size of the Integrity Fund, nor the power of my new title, Chief Strategic Architect. The real triumph was internal, the quiet, definitive moment I realized that professional dignity is not granted by an institution, it is chosen by the self. They had tried to categorize me as disposable, a retired footnote in the company's grand narrative. I had forced them to rewrite the entire text, establishing my value as undeniable and permanent. The days that followed my return were characterized by a profound, cold efficiency. I moved through the executive tower, not seeking confrontation, but implementing the meticulous changes required to stabilize Project Hydra. Wallace and Camilla offered strained professional courtesies, their fear of the signed confession ensuring their permanent compliance. They could not fire me, they could not contradict me, and they could not question my architectural authority. I was, by their own legal admission, necessary. But the most potent shift was the realization that I was no longer fighting for a salary or a title. I was fighting for the Matriarch's will, the principle that skill and ethical foresight must always supersede superficial brand imaging. My work was now dedicated not just to fixing the company's architecture, but to ensuring that the next generation of talent, funded by the Eleanor Tech Ethics Mentorship Fund, would never face the same humiliating dismissal. I finally understood what it meant to live in the front row. It wasn't a physical seat in the boardroom, it was a state of professional being. It meant standing at the center of the architecture, unyielding, and demanding that my value be measured by my competence, not their comfort. The $50,000 they had offered for my silence felt utterly irrelevant now, a trivial transaction in a much larger exchange of power. The most profound healing came not from the corporate resolution, but from the renewed relationship with my son, Michael. He did not ask about the status of the legal case, he asked about the architecture. He asked about the principles of the fund. He had finally learned the difficult lesson: the turbulence of truth is preferable to the quiet compromise of silence. He saw the strength required to demand accountability, and he measured his own professional life against the ethical foundation I had fiercely protected. The final, silent act of my counterstrike involved the Orphan Key. The key, now safely secured in escrow by Helen's firm, remained my ultimate insurance policy. I had agreed not to use it, but I maintained the sole knowledge of its activation sequence. This knowledge was my permanent, unchallengeable leverage. It was the quiet, fundamental truth that while I was committed to the system's stability, my allegiance was first and foremost to professional integrity itself. Looking back on the moment of my humiliation, the cruel words about my incompatible skill no longer stung. They had been the fuel for the most significant transformation of my career. They had forced me to define my worth outside the confines of their approval. My dignity was not granted by their acceptance, it was forged in the fire of their betrayal. I was no longer disposable. I was the chief strategic architect, the integrity monitor, the founder of the Eleanor Fund, and the architect of my own professional fate. I had traded the temporary comfort of quiet retirement for the permanent, unyielding authority of the Matriarch. The story ends not with revenge, but with the quiet, profound realization that the greatest power one can wield is the absolute, non-negotiable choice to define one's own worth. I chose to live in the front row, a space earned by competence, secured by strategy, and defended by an unwavering commitment to professional self-respect. And for anyone else who has been dismissed, categorized, or undervalued for their unique skill, I leave you with this certainty: they cannot determine your worth. Only you can. And sometimes, the price of that determination is the key to an empire's survival.